At this very moment, oil is hovering dangerously close to $100 a barrel. Just days ago, it flirted with $120. Across the country, gas stations are scrambling to update their signs every other day. Heating costs are skyrocketing, and your grocery bill is next in line. Size why? Because the Strait of Hormuz, the vital maritime artery that funnels 20% of the globe's oil, has essentially been slammed shut. Iranian forces are targeting freighters. Naval mines block the waters. Right now, over 150 ships sit paralyzed outside the strait, trapping 15 million barrels of crude in the Persian Gulf. Amidst this absolute chaos, with supply chains snapping and U.S. refineries going into panic mode, Donald Trump picked up the phone and called Mark Carney. Surprised, this wasn't a rant on Truth Social. There were no nicknames or jokes about Canada being the 51st state. This was a highly classified, back-channel distress call that Washington prayed would never leak. Because the reason for the call was utterly humiliating, Trump was begging Canada for a lifeline. He desperately needed Carney to promise that Canadian crude would keep flowing into the U.S., essentially asking for a bailout from a country his administration had spent the past year treating like a helpless territory. But Carney's response was just 5 words long. And according to insiders who know about the call, those 5 words instantly killed the conversation and threw the Oval Office into absolute panic. We have other buyers now. At this very moment, oil is hovering dangerously close to $100 a barrel. Just days ago, it flirted with $120. Across the country, gas stations are scrambling to update their signs every other day. Heating costs are skyrocketing, and your grocery bill is next in line. Why? Because the Strait of Hormuz, the vital maritime artery that funnels 20% of the globe's oil, has essentially been slammed shut. Iranian forces are targeting freighters. Naval mines block the waters. Right now, over 150 ships sit paralyzed outside the strait, trapping 15 million barrels of crude in the Persian Gulf. Amidst this absolute chaos, with supply chains snapping and U.S. refineries going into panic mode, Donald Trump picked up the phone and called Mark Carney. This wasn't a rant on Truth Social. There were no nicknames or jokes about Canada being the 51st state. This was a highly classified, back-channel distress call that Washington prayed would never leak. Because the reason for the call was utterly humiliating, Trump was begging Canada for a lifeline. He desperately needed Carney to promise that Canadian crude would keep flowing into the U.S., essentially asking for a bailout from a country his administration had spent the past year treating like a helpless territory. But Carney's response was just 5 words long. And according to insiders who know about the call, those 5 words instantly killed the conversation and threw the Oval Office into absolute panic. We have other buyers now. In the next few minutes, I am going to explain why this short sentence holds more destructive weight than any tariff Trump ever imposed, and why, if you drive, pay for heat, or buy food, this single phone call is already hitting your wallet this week. But to grasp the sheer gravity of this moment, we have to rewind and look at the chaos in the Persian Gulf first, and how Trump systematically dismantled the US-Canada alliance right before he needed it the most. It all started on February 28, 2026. The US and Israel executed a massive, coordinated air campaign against Iran, dubbed Operation Epic Fury. The strikes took out key leadership compounds, military bases, and nuclear facilities. But Iran didn't respond with conventional military force. They responded with economics, and it was brutal. Within hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard sent out a chilling maritime broadcast. No vessel is permitted to cross the Strait of Hormuz. In just 2 days, tanker movement plummeted by 70%. By March 4th, an Iranian commander officially declared the strait closed, vowing to destroy any ship that dared to cross. Mines were deployed, tankers were struck, and crew members tragically lost their lives. This is not just a regional dispute, it is a global catastrophe. 20 million barrels of crude pass through here daily. That is a fifth of the world's total oil supply. Massive economies like China, Japan, South Korea, and India rely on this exact waterway for 69% of their crude. A third of the global fertilizer trade and 30% of Europe's aviation fuel go through this choke point. The market reacted exactly how physics dictates. Brent crude shot from $73 to nearly $120 almost overnight. Domestic oil jumped 10% in a single trading session when Iran's new supreme leader promised to expand the conflict. Even with the international community coordinating the largest emergency reserve release in history, 400 million barrels, it wasn't enough to stop the bleeding. Despite the U.S. Defense Secretary warning that Iran would be hit 20 times harder, Tehran held firm. Not a single drop of Middle Eastern oil leaves until the attacks cease. The U.S. military took out 16 Iranian mine-laying ships, but here is the dark secret the Pentagon is not broadcasting. The U.S. Navy retired its last specialized minesweepers in that region just last September. So the most powerful military in human history is trying to unblock the world's most critical trade route without the actual ships built for that specific job. That is the crisis. That is the stage. And that is exactly why Trump was forced to make that phone call. Which brings us to the brutal math. The U.S. buys about 3.8 million barrels of oil from Canada every single day. That is 60% of America's crude imports. Not just a piece of the pie, the vast majority. On top of that, Canada provides 85% of imported U.S. electricity and dominates as a supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium. But volume alone does not explain why Canada is truly irreplaceable. Refineries across the American Midwest and Gulf Coast were custom-built to process heavy Canadian crude. You cannot just pump light Middle Eastern oil or domestic crude into those facilities. Swapping suppliers isn't like picking a different gas station. It requires billions of dollars and years of construction to retrofit these plants for alternative oil grades. An executive order cannot rewrite refinery chemistry. Normally, with the global market flowing, this dependency is fine. Saudi Arabia and Iraq provide a buffer, but with Hormuz blocked, that buffer vanished. Saudi and Iraqi oil is trapped behind the blockade. Venezuela is a fraction of its former self. And domestic U.S. drilling simply cannot replace the massive volume of heavy crude America needs right now. The reality is terrifyingly simple. Canada is no longer just America's largest trading partner. Right now, Canada is America's sole massive energy lifeline. And Donald Trump just spent the last 12 months pouring gasoline on that lifeline and striking a match. Let's look at the timeline of how Washington turned its most secure energy ally into a weapon pointed at itself. In March 2025, Trump slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, including a historic 10% tax on Canadian energy. This was the first time in modern history the US taxed Canadian energy crossing the border. By the summer of 2025, steel and aluminum tariffs skyrocketed to 50%, pushing the total Canadian tariff burden to 35%. All the while, Trump consistently demeaned CARNEY, publicly referring to the Prime Minister as governor, a calculated insult to strip Canada of its sovereign respect. In October 2025, Trump blew up trade talks entirely because an Ontario commercial used Ronald Reagan's own words to criticize the tariffs. He literally threatened a 10% surcharge as punishment for a TV ad. By January 2026, after CARNEY secured a trade agreement with China, a deal Trump praised just a week prior, Trump threw a fit and threatened to hit Canada with 100% tariffs across the board. The next month, he threatened to block the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a massive border project Canada funded entirely on its own. But while Trump was throwing punches on social media, CARNEY was quietly building escape routes. Canada aggressively scaled up its LNG exports, targeting 50 million tons for Asian markets by 2030. They forged a massive energy alliance with China. CARNEY utilized emergency authority to fast-track pipelines to the Pacific coast. Ottawa even launched an $81 billion defense overhaul aimed explicitly at gaining strategic autonomy from Washington. Canada heard Trump's message loud and clear: find new buyers or remain a hostage forever. So they listened, they planned, and they built on a timeline measured in years. When the Middle East erupted, Canada wasn't scrambling for a backup plan. They had already constructed it. So when oil crossed $90 and US refineries started sounding the alarm, the phone rang. Washington dressed the request in polite diplomatic terms, asking for energy stability. But stripped of the jargon, Trump was saying, "We are in trouble, and we need you not to exploit this crisis." Sources close to the Canadian side say CARNEY's tone on the phone was perfectly polite, but absolutely freezing. It wasn't fueled by rage, it was fueled by total clarity. He listened to the dire situation and then delivered his 5-word reality check. We have other buyers now. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was an undeniable statement of fact. And that distinction means everything. An ultimatum is a demand you can negotiate. CARNEY was communicating a permanent structural shift. Canada's alternative markets are no longer theoretical. Trump's own aggressive tariffs had accelerated their timeline, producing real pipelines, signed contracts, and Asian superpowers hungry for Canadian crude, LNG, and uranium. The message was crystal clear: we don't need to threaten you, because we simply don't need you anymore. The call ended abruptly. There was no joint statement, no press release, just the terrifying realization inside the Oval Office that their ultimate leverage, buy from us or else, had completely backfired. When CARNEY later posted online about speaking with Trump on various issues, that sanitized language hit a brutal reality that shook Washington to its core. 3 massive things have permanently altered the North American energy landscape, and it comes down to physics and chemistry, not politics. First, the LNG Canada mega facility in British Columbia is up and running. CARNEY's emergency use of national security powers to fast-track Pacific pipelines isn't just a political promise, it's active construction happening right now. Second, The energy partnership with Beijing is locked in. China wants Canadian LNG, heavy crude, and uranium. Long term contracts are being signed with the capital to lock down whatever Canada can supply. Third, and this keeps military strategists awake at night, Canada controls nearly 40% of the world's uranium. As the AI boom demands massive nuclear power to run data centers, uranium is the fuel of the next century. China knows this. CARNEY knows this. And Washington is just waking up to it. The Hormuz crisis didn't give Canada this leverage. Trump's tariffs did by forcing them to diversify. The crisis just revealed it at the worst possible second for America. So, how does this hit your wallet this week? Gas is projected to hit $4.50 to $5 a gallon by April just from the Hormuz closure alone. If Canada diverts even 20% of its crude to its new Asian partners, and those deals are happening as we speak, Midwest gas prices could skyrocket another 35 to 50%. You are looking at a double-barrel crisis at the pump. Add to that the 85% of electricity the US imports from Canada. Ottawa has already hinted those deals are being reviewed based on the overall bilateral relationship. In plain English, your utility bill is now tied to a diplomatic alliance Trump spent a year trying to destroy. Fertilizer costs have surged, meaning the food you buy this fall will cost significantly more. Auto manufacturers, steel producers, and chemical plants in the Midwest are facing a brutal squeeze that will inevitably lead to massive layoffs and cut shifts. The president who promised energy dominance just walked into a crisis that closed the world's most important oil route while alienating the one country that supplies 60% of America's crude. That isn't dominance. That is playing energy Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the cylinder. We are now staring down 3 distinct scenarios, and which one you believe is coming will directly impact your finances this year. Scenario 1, the emergency fix. The global crisis forces a diplomatic reset. Trump swallows his pride, drops the energy tariffs, and CARNEY extracts massive structural concessions and an end to the disrespectful rhetoric. This requires Trump to admit he needs Canada more than they need him. Scenario 2, the ego spiral. Trump doubles down, threatening emergency powers to force Canadian oil south. Canada accelerates its pivot to Asia, locking in decades of supply deals with China and Japan. US refineries face massive shortages. Gas hits levels worse than 2008, and the midterm elections become a referendum on a self-inflicted energy disaster. Scenario 3, the permanent pivot. The Middle East crisis drags out long enough that Canada's Asian infrastructure becomes permanently locked into 20-year contracts. Even when the Persian Gulf finally reopens, that heavy crude is going to Shanghai, not Chicago. Washington is left with billions in refinery retrofits and no quick fix. As CARNEY himself noted, personalities change, but infrastructure is permanent. Pipelines and 20-year supply contracts are systems, and systems don't disappear just because a tariff is finally lifted. Mark Carney didn't have to threaten Donald Trump. He just stated a new geographical truth in 5 words that completely changed North American energy. We have other buyers now. Those 5 words are the direct result of 12 months of insults, canceled talks, border threats, and treating a sovereign ally like a subordinate state. So, when you're paying $5 a gallon this spring, I want to know your thoughts in the comments, and I read every single one. Who is to blame? The Canadian leader who secured his country's future because he had to, or the American president who spent 12 months backing him into a corner? That is the defining question of the upcoming midterms. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Oil is still surging. The Canadian contracts are still being signed. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours will decide if America's energy grid relies on Ottawa or Beijing. Do not look away.